The Bordeaux hit my face like a slap from reality itself. Rich, expensive, and utterly humiliating as it dripped down my chin onto my white dress shirt. The dining room fell silent, except for the grandfather clock ticking in the corner of Drake Torrin's mansion, counting the seconds of my public disgrace. Thanks, Dad. Maybe that'll teach him some respect. Filthy pig. Calla Torrin's laughter cut through the silence like broken glass. My wife's sister sat there in her designer dress, practically glowing with satisfaction at my humiliation. I felt my hands grip the chair beneath me. The mahogany groaned under the pressure. My wife Ember sat across from me, her expression as cold and unreadable as always. Not a word of protest, not even a flicker of embarrassment for her father's behavior. Just that calculating stare I'd grown to recognize over our 8 years of marriage. Drake Torrin, construction magnate and self-appointed king of our little Texas suburb, leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man who'd just won another battle. At 68, he still carried himself like the college linebacker he'd once been, though the recent weight loss made his expensive suit hang loose on his frame. Maybe now you'll understand your place in this family, Holden, Drake said, dabbing his mouth with a napkin as if nothing had happened. A man who can't even provide properly for his wife and child has no business sitting at my table acting like an equal. The wine continued its slow journey down my face. I could taste the bitter tannins on my lips. Around the table, the rest of the family watched with varying degrees of amusement and discomfort. My 7-year-old son Nate stared at his plate, probably wishing he could disappear. I stood up slowly, feeling the chair legs scrape against the hardwood floor. Everyone tensed, expecting an explosion. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. "Colonel," I said when the call connected. My voice was steady, almost conversational. "It's time." The silence stretched longer this time. Drake's confident smirk faltered slightly. Ember's eyes narrowed. Even Calla stopped her giggling. "Time for what?" Drake demanded. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Then I looked directly at Drake, letting him see something in my expression that made him shift uncomfortably in his chair. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," I said quietly. "The thing about being underestimated your entire adult life is that people forget you might have skills they've never bothered to ask about. They see what they want to see." Drake saw a failed entrepreneur whose cybersecurity firm had gone under 2 years ago. Ember saw a husband who'd become financially dependent on her family. Calla saw an easy target for her casual cruelty. None of them had ever asked about my 12 years in defense intelligence. They'd never wondered why a man with my background had chosen to start a small tech company in suburban Texas. They certainly hadn't considered that someone with my particular expertise might have been watching, learning, and preparing for exactly this moment. I walked to the guest bathroom and cleaned the wine from my face with methodical precision. In the mirror, I looked like the same Holden Ravell who'd been absorbing their contempt for years. But something fundamental had shifted. The chair had broken first, metaphorically speaking. Now it was time to see what else would crack under pressure. When I returned to the dining room, the conversation had resumed in forced, uncomfortable tones. Drake was telling some story about a construction project, but his heart wasn't in it. He kept glancing at me with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Holden," Ember said as I sat back down, "what was that phone call about?" "Just business," I replied, cutting into my steak with deliberate calm. "You know how it is." But she didn't know. None of them did. That was about to change. The rest of dinner passed in relative quiet. I answered when spoken to, made appropriate comments about the food, and generally behaved like the defeated son-in-law they expected me to be. Inside, though, I was running calculations, timelines, probabilities, risk assessments. By the time we left Drake's house that evening, I had already begun to implement a plan 6 months in the making. The wine attack had simply moved up my timeline. Ember drove home in silence, which was fine by me. Nate fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted by the tension he didn't fully understand, but certainly felt. As we pulled into our driveway, Ember finally spoke. "You embarrassed me tonight." I almost laughed. "I embarrassed you?" "That phone call, that look you gave my father, you made everyone uncomfortable." "Good," I said, getting out of the car. "Comfort is overrated." 3 hours later, I sat in my home office with a cup of coffee and Ember's laptop. She'd left it charging in the kitchen, password unchanged from our anniversary date. Some habits never change, even when everything else does. The GPS history told a story that would have broken a different man's heart. 340 visits to 1247 Maple Grove Drive over the past 18 months. Asher Trevan's address. The man Drake had introduced as his business associate at last year's Christmas party. The same man who'd been copied on half of Ember's work emails for reasons that had nothing to do with construction contracts. I downloaded the data to an encrypted drive, then moved on to her text messages. The conversation thread with Asher painted a picture of a relationship that had progressed far beyond professional courtesy. They had their own little jokes, shared references, and a level of intimacy that made my coffee taste like ash. The most recent exchange was from yesterday. Asher: "Looking forward to our Denver meeting next week." Ember: "Me too. I've missed our private consultations." Asher: "Your husband still clueless?" Ember: "Completely. Sometimes I think he's brain damaged." I saved everything to the encrypted drive, then returned the laptop to exactly where I'd found it. Ember would wake up tomorrow with no idea that her digital infidelity had been documented, cataloged, and prepared for strategic deployment. My phone buzzed. A text from Colonel: "Package delivered. Check your secure email." I opened my laptop and accessed the encrypted account I'd maintained since my government days. Colonel's report was thorough, as always. James Colonel Morrison had been my partner in defense intelligence for 6 years before retiring to start his own private investigation firm. When I'd called him 6 months ago with concerns about my marriage, he'd agreed to help with the same quiet efficiency that had made him invaluable in the service. The financial records made for fascinating reading. Drake Torrin Construction had been billing the Pentagon for armor plating installations that had never happened. $47 million in fraudulent invoices over 6 years, all approved by contractors who were either incompetent or complicit. The beauty of the scheme was its simplicity. Charge for premium materials, install standard equipment, pocket the difference. What made it even more interesting was the paper trail leading back to Asher Trevan's defense contracting firm. He wasn't just my wife's lover, he was Drake's partner in systematic fraud against the United States government. I leaned back in my chair, considering the implications. These people had spent years treating me like a failure, a charity case, a burden on their successful family. They had no idea that their success was built on crimes I was uniquely qualified to expose. My secure email chimed again. Another message from Colonel: "Judge Marlo Trasker, Family Court, college roommate of Drake Torrin, University of Texas class of 1976. Handles 80% of custody cases in the county. Thought you should know." I stared at the screen, pieces clicking into place. The house Ember and I had bought 3 years ago was titled under Drake's LLC for tax purposes. Ember had assured me it was temporary, just paperwork. Now I understood why she'd been so insistent on that arrangement. They weren't just planning to humiliate me. They were planning to destroy me completely. Take my son, take my home, leave me with nothing but the clothes on my back and the satisfaction of knowing I'd been thoroughly outmaneuvered by people who considered themselves my superiors. The only problem with their plan was that they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They thought I was harmless. I opened a new document and began typing. By morning, I would have a comprehensive dossier ready for delivery to federal agent Tessa Hartline, my former colleague who now worked financial crimes for the FBI. The evidence was overwhelming, the paper trail clear, and the potential prosecutions numerous. But that was just the beginning. Financial crimes were serious, but they were also abstract, impersonal. What I wanted was something more immediate, more visceral. I wanted them to feel the same humiliation they'd been inflicting on me for years. I wanted them to understand what it felt like to be powerless. My phone rang, Ember's name on the display. "Where are you?" she asked when I answered. "Office, working." "It's 2 a.m. "Insomnia," I said. "Your father's wine gave me indigestion." A pause. "Holden, about tonight." "What about it?" "Maybe you should apologize to him. He's not well, and the stress isn't good for him." I almost asked what kind of stress she meant. The stress of terminal cancer he thought no one knew about? The stress of federal investigators closing in on his fraudulent contracts? The stress of watching his carefully constructed empire begin to crumble? Instead, I said, "I'll consider it." "Good. I'm going to Denver tomorrow for that Trevan Industries meeting. I'll be back Friday." "Of course you will." Another pause. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing, Ember. Have a safe trip." I hung up and returned to my work. By the time the sun rose, I had assembled enough evidence to destroy 3 lives, ruin 2 businesses, and expose a corruption network that reached from suburban Texas to the Pentagon. The chair had broken first. Now it was time to see how much else would come apart when I started pulling the right strings. The GPS tracker Colonel had planted on Drake's delivery truck led us to a warehouse complex on the industrial side of town. At 2 a.m, the place was deserted, except for security lights casting long shadows between the buildings. Perfect conditions for what we needed to do. "Building 7, Colonel whispered, checking his tablet. "Truck's been parked there for 3 hours. We approached from the rear, using techniques that felt familiar, despite being years out of practice. The warehouse had minimal security, just basic locks and an alarm system that Colonel disabled with equipment that probably wasn't entirely legal. But then again, what we were about to discover wasn't entirely legal either. Inside, the warehouse was filled with shipping containers marked with Pentagon procurement codes, standard military equipment storage, at least on the surface. But when Colonel pried open the first container, we found something very different from what the invoices claimed. "Standard steel plating," he said, running his hand along the metal sheets. "Maybe half an inch thick. According to your documents, this should be composite ceramic armor, 3 inches minimum." I photographed everything while Colonel took measurements. Container after container told the same story. Substandard materials billed at premium prices, all destined for military installations where soldiers' lives depended on the protection these materials were supposed to provide. "There," Colonel pointed to a stack of shipping manifests in the corner. "Croatian import stamps. That's interesting." The manifests revealed something even more damaging than fraud. Mixed in with the legitimate construction materials were crates of weapons that definitely weren't supposed to be in a civilian warehouse. Military-grade hardware with serial numbers that traced back to Eastern European arms dealers. "Your father-in-law has been busy," Colonel said, photographing the serial numbers. "This isn't just billing fraud, this is arms trafficking." I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. Drake Torrin, pillar of the community, respected businessman, had been running weapons through his construction company while billing the government for materials that put American soldiers at risk. The man who'd thrown wine in my face and called me worthless was a traitor in the most literal sense. "How long do you think this has been going on?" I asked. "Based on the shipping dates? At least 4 years, maybe longer." Colonel sealed the container and reset the locks with practiced efficiency. "Your friend Asher Trevan's signature is all over these manifests too. They're full partners in this." We left the warehouse exactly as we'd found it, except for the nearly invisible tracking devices Colonel placed on key containers. When the FBI eventually raided the place, They'd have perfect documentation of every item's location and movement. The drive home was quiet. Colonel had seen enough combat to be unimpressed by most forms of human corruption, but even he seemed subdued by what we'd discovered. "You know this changes things," he said as we pulled into my driveway. "Once the federal investigation starts, these people are looking at serious prison time, 20 years minimum." "Good," I said. "I'm serious, Holden. This isn't just about your marriage anymore. These are dangerous people with a lot to lose. They might do something desperate when they realize how much trouble they're in." I considered that. Drake was terminally ill, which made him unpredictable. Asher was weak and self-serving, likely to panic when pressure was applied. Ember was calculating and cold, but she'd also been living a lie for years. When that lie collapsed, her reaction could be extreme. "I can handle them," I said. "Can you handle Nate being in the middle of it?" That question followed me into the house and kept me awake for the remaining hours before dawn. My son was innocent in all of this, but he was also Drake's grandson and Ember's child. When the investigation started, the media attention would be intense. Nate would hear things about his family that no 7-year-old should have to process. But the alternative was letting them continue their crimes while treating me like garbage. That wasn't acceptable either. I made coffee and sat in my kitchen, watching the sun come up through the window. Ember was already in Denver, probably sharing a hotel room with Asher while planning how to finalize my destruction. They thought they were so clever, so far ahead of the game. My phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "We know what you've been doing. Stop now or face consequences." I stared at the message, then forwarded it to Colonel with a note. "Trace this." His response came back in minutes. "Burner phone, purchased yesterday with cash. Could be any of them." So they were watching me. Good. Let them watch. Let them worry. Let them wonder what I knew and what I was planning to do with that knowledge. I had spent years being reactive, absorbing their contempt and manipulation, while trying to keep my family together. That phase of my life was over. From now on, I would be setting the pace of events. My secure email chimed. A message from Tessa Hartline. "Received your package. This is significant. Can you meet today?" I typed back, "Name the time and place." The federal investigation was about to begin. Drake, Ember, Asher, and Judge Trasker had no idea that their world was about to collapse around them. They thought they were dealing with the same broken man they'd been tormenting for years. They were about to learn otherwise. The FBI field office in downtown Dallas felt like stepping back into my old life. Same institutional gray walls, same fluorescent lighting, same sense of purposeful tension that I'd once thrived on. Agent Tessa Hartline met me in the lobby, looking exactly as I remembered from our defense intelligence days. Sharp, focused, and completely unimpressed by anything that didn't directly relate to her cases. "Holden," she said, shaking my hand. "You look like hell." "Thanks. You always knew how to make a man feel special." She led me through security and up to a conference room where she'd already spread out the documents I'd sent her. Financial records, shipping manifests, photographs from the warehouse, GPS tracking data. The evidence covered every inch of the table. "This is impressive work," she said, settling into a chair across from me. "Also, completely inadmissible in court since you obtained most of it through illegal surveillance. I figured you'd find your own sources once you knew where to look." "Already started. We've had Drake Torrin construction on our radar for 6 months, but couldn't get enough evidence for a warrant. Your information changes that." She picked up one of the shipping manifests. "The weapons trafficking is new, though. That makes this a national security issue." "How long before you move?" "Depends on how much you're willing to cooperate. We need someone inside their operation to document the current activity, someone they trust." I laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "They don't trust me. They barely tolerate me." "But your wife does, and she's having an affair with Asher Trevan, who's Drake's business partner. That gives us leverage." Tessa had always been direct, but this felt particularly cold even for her. She was talking about using my wife's infidelity as an investigative tool. What exactly are you asking me to do? Nothing illegal. Just document what you see and hear. Your wife thinks you're clueless, so she's not being careful around you. Asher probably brags about their deals when he thinks no one important is listening. Drake might let things slip when he's trying to humiliate you. And in exchange, we make sure the custody arrangements work out in your favor when this all comes apart. Judge Trasker won't be handling family court cases much longer. The offer was tempting, but it meant months of continuing the charade, months of pretending to be the same defeated man while my wife and her lover planned my destruction. There's something else you should know, I said. Drake is terminal. Pancreatic cancer, maybe 8 weeks left. He's trying to settle all his scores before he goes. Tessa's expression sharpened. That accelerates everything. Desperate people make mistakes, but they also take bigger risks. If he thinks he's going to lose everything anyway, he might decide to take some people with him. Meaning you need to be very careful. A man with nothing to lose and access to illegal weapons is dangerous in ways you might not anticipate. I left the FBI office with a secure phone and instructions to document everything I could without arousing suspicion. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was now officially working undercover against my own family. The drive home took me past Drake's mansion. His Cadillac was in the driveway, along with 2 other cars I didn't recognize. A meeting of some kind, probably discussing how to handle whatever they thought I was planning. My new secure phone buzzed. A text from Colonel. Your friend Asher just booked a flight back from Denver, arriving tonight instead of Friday. Ember's staying through the weekend. Interesting. Either their romantic getaway had been cut short by business concerns, or Asher was coming back to deal with the Holden problem, while Ember maintained her alibi. I drove to Nate's school and waited in the pickup line, watching other parents go through their normal routines. Soccer practice, piano lessons, play dates, the ordinary concerns of people whose lives weren't about to implode. When Nate climbed into the car, he was unusually quiet. Everything okay, buddy? I asked. Dad, why did Grandpa throw wine at you? The question hit harder than I'd expected. Nate had been processing the dinner scene for 2 days, trying to understand why adults in his family would behave that way. Sometimes adults get angry and do things they shouldn't, I said carefully. It wasn't your fault, and it wasn't really about you. But it was about you. Yeah, it was about me. Are you in trouble? I looked at my son in the rearview mirror, 7 years old, worried about his father, caught in the middle of something he couldn't possibly understand. Whatever happened next, I had to make sure he came through it safely. No, Nate, I'm not in trouble, but things might get complicated for a while. What kind of complicated? The kind where we might need to move somewhere new. Would that be okay with you? He considered this with the seriousness that children bring to life-changing questions. Would Mom come with us? I don't know yet. Oh. A pause. Would I still see Grandpa and Aunt Calla? Maybe not for a while. Another pause. That might be okay. They're not very nice to you. Out of the mouths of babes. My 7-year-old son had figured out what I'd been trying to ignore for years. The Torrin family's treatment of me was fundamentally wrong, and everyone could see it. You're a smart kid, I said. I know. Mom says I get it from her side of the family. I almost laughed. Ember's casual cruelty extended even to comments about our son's intelligence. But if Nate was smart enough to see through their behavior, maybe he was smart enough to handle whatever came next. My secure phone buzzed again. Another message from Colonel. Asher's plane landed. He's driving straight to Drake's house. The meeting was starting. Time to see what they were planning for me. I parked across the street from Drake's mansion and called the secure number Tessa had given me. I'm outside Drake's house, I said when she answered. Asher Trevan just arrived for what looks like an emergency meeting. Can you get close enough to hear anything? Maybe. The office windows face the backyard. If they're meeting in there, I might be able to position myself near the garden. Do it. But be careful. If they catch you, this whole investigation could be compromised. I ended the call and walked around to the rear of the property. Drake's backyard was extensive, with mature trees and landscaping that provided decent cover. The office windows were partially open, and I could hear voices inside. "Can't let him continue," Asher was saying. His voice carried the edge of panic. "He knows something. That phone call at dinner wasn't random." "Holden's harmless," Ember's voice. She was back from Denver earlier than planned. "He's been broken for 2 years. No money, no prospects, completely dependent on us." "Then explain the surveillance," Drake said. "Someone's been watching the warehouse. Professional work, not some amateur with a grudge." "What surveillance?" Ember sounded genuinely surprised. "Motion sensors triggered twice this week, both times at night, both times by someone who knew how to avoid the cameras. That takes training." "You think Holden—" "I think your husband isn't what he appears to be," Drake interrupted. "I did some checking after that dinner performance. Defense Intelligence, 12 years, specialized in financial crimes and weapons trafficking. The man we've been treating like an idiot is an expert in exactly the kind of business we're running." The silence that followed was profound. I could picture Ember's face as the implications sank in. All those years of casual contempt, all those comments about my failures and inadequacies, suddenly viewed through the lens of my actual background. "He's been watching us," Asher said finally. "Gathering evidence." "For how long?" Ember's voice was smaller now. "Does it matter?" Drake's tone was grim. "The question is what we do about it." "We could offer him a partnership," Asher suggested. "Cut him in on the profits, make it worth his while to stay quiet." "With what leverage?" Drake laughed, a harsh sound. "He's got evidence of federal crimes. We've got his wife's infidelity. That's not exactly an even trade." "Then what do you suggest?" "We accelerate the timeline. Judge Trasker files the custody paperwork tomorrow. Emergency hearing based on Holden's increasingly erratic behavior. By the end of the week, he's out of the house with supervised visitation only. And if he tries to use whatever evidence he has? Who's going to believe a bitter ex-husband with a history of mental instability? Especially when Judge Trasker's report documents his threats and violent tendencies. I felt my hands clench into fists. They were planning to have me declared mentally unstable and stripped of custody rights based on fabricated evidence. Judge Trasker would rubber stamp whatever story they invented, and I'd lose everything that mattered to me. "What about the federal investigation?" Ember asked. "We shut down the warehouse operations immediately. Move everything offshore. By the time any investigation starts, there won't be evidence to find." "And Holden?" "Holden becomes someone else's problem, preferably in another state." The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, but I'd heard enough. They weren't just planning to destroy me financially and personally, they were planning to make me disappear entirely. The only thing standing between me and complete ruin was their underestimation of my capabilities. I made my way back to the car and called Tessa. "They're moving fast," I said, "shutting down the warehouse, filing false custody papers, planning to have me declared mentally unstable." "How long do we have?" "Judge Trasker files paperwork tomorrow. They want me out of the house by the end of the week. Then we move tonight. I'll have teams at the warehouse in 2 hours. Can you get us inside Drake's house?" "His office safe. That's where he keeps the really sensitive documents. I can get you the combination." "How?" "Because I've been watching him enter it for 3 years. Drake's not as careful as he thinks he is." The federal raid on the warehouse would happen in darkness, with overwhelming force and perfect documentation. By morning, Drake Torrin Construction would be a crime scene, and its owners would be facing federal charges. But that was just the legal resolution. I wanted something more personal, something that would make them feel the same helplessness they'd been inflicting on me. I drove home and waited for Ember to return. When she walked through the door at 9 p.m., She looked tired and stressed. The meeting at her father's house had clearly been difficult. "How was Denver?" I asked from the kitchen. "Fine. Productive." She didn't meet my eyes. "I'm exhausted. Going to bed early." "Before you do, there's something we need to discuss." She paused at the bottom of the stairs. "What?" "I know about Asher." The color drained from her face. For a moment, she looked exactly like what she was, a woman caught in a lie that was about to destroy her life. "I don't know what you're talking about." 340 GPS pings at his address, 18 months of text messages, hotel receipts from Denver. I kept my voice calm, conversational. "I know everything, Ember." She sat down heavily on the stairs. "How long have you known?" "Long enough to prepare for what comes next." "What comes next?" I smiled, and something in my expression made her flinch. "You'll find out soon enough. Sweet dreams." The federal raids would begin in 3 hours. By morning, her entire world would be in ruins, and she'd finally understand what it felt like to be powerless. The chair had broken first. Now everything else would follow. The FBI hit the warehouse at 4 a.m. with enough agents to secure a small city. I watched the operation from Tessa's command vehicle, parked 2 blocks away with a clear view of the industrial complex. Floodlights turned night into day as teams moved through the buildings with military precision. "Building 7 secured," came the radio report. "Multiple containers of illegal weapons confirmed, requesting ATF support for inventory. Building 12 secured. Financial documents recovered from office safe, requesting forensic accounting team." Drake's entire operation was being dismantled piece by piece, every container cataloged, every document photographed. The evidence I'd helped gather over 6 months was finally being put to use by people with badges and warrants. "Your father-in-law's phone has been ringing for 20 minutes, Tessa said, monitoring the communications intercepts. "Probably his warehouse manager trying to report the raid. He won't answer unknown numbers at this hour, too paranoid." "Good. We want him to find out the hard way." At 6 a.m., we moved to Drake's house. The warrant was comprehensive, covering all financial records, communications, and physical evidence related to the weapons trafficking operation. I stayed in the car while federal agents knocked on the front door. Drake answered in his bathrobe, looking every one of his 68 years. Even from a distance, I could see his face change as he processed what was happening. Shock, then anger, then the cold calculation of a man realizing his empire was collapsing. "Holden Ravell?" One of the agents called to me. "Agent Hartline says you can identify the office safe." I walked through the front door of Drake's mansion as a federal witness rather than a humiliated son-in-law. The role reversal was deeply satisfying. Drake stood in his living room, hands cuffed behind his back, watching me direct agents to his most sensitive documents. "You," he said when he saw me. "You did this." "I documented your crimes," I corrected. "You did this to yourself. My daughter will never forgive you for destroying her family." "Your daughter helped you commit federal crimes while planning to steal my son. She'll be lucky if forgiveness is her biggest problem." The safe contained exactly what I'd expected. Detailed financial records of the fraudulent Pentagon contracts, shipping manifests for the weapons trafficking, and correspondence with Eastern European arms dealers. Everything needed to prove a pattern of criminal activity spanning 6 years. "There's something else," I told Tessa, pointing to a manila folder marked personal. "Judge Trasker's financial records. Drake's been paying him monthly for favorable rulings." She opened the folder and whistled softly. $50,000 a month for 4 years. Every custody case, every divorce settlement, every property dispute. This is systematic corruption of the family court system. By 8 a.m., the house had been thoroughly searched, and Drake was on his way to federal detention. Judge Trasker was arrested at his courthouse office, along with Asher Trevan at his corporate headquarters. The local news was already running breaking stories about the massive federal corruption investigation that had destroyed 3 prominent local businesses overnight. I drove home to find Ember sitting in our kitchen, still in her pajamas, staring at her phone. The news alerts had clearly reached her. "They arrested my father," she said without looking up. "I know. I was there." "You were there?" She looked at me with something approaching horror. "You watched them arrest him?" "I helped them arrest him, along with your boyfriend and your pet judge." She stood up slowly, her face cycling through emotions I'd never seen before. Rage, fear, disbelief, and something that might have been respect. "You planned this. All of it. For 6 months. Ever since I realized what you were really doing with those business trips to Denver. The phone call at dinner. You weren't calling about business. I was calling the FBI. Your father's wine attack just moved up the timeline." Ember sat back down, the full scope of her situation finally becoming clear. Her father was facing 20 years for weapons trafficking. Her lover was facing similar charges for conspiracy. The judge who was supposed to rule in her favor was facing his own corruption charges, and her husband, the man she'd dismissed as a broken failure, had orchestrated the destruction of everything she'd counted on. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you face the consequences of your choices. Federal investigators will want to interview you about your knowledge of your father's business activities. The house will be seized as proceeds of criminal activity. Your job will disappear when Trevan Industries goes under, and Nate will come to live with me in Vancouver while you figure out how to rebuild your life." "Vancouver? I have a job offer there. Clean start, away from all this mess." I poured myself coffee, enjoying the normalcy of the action. "Don't worry. I'll make sure Nate can visit you once the legal issues are resolved. You can't take my son away from me. I'm not taking him anywhere. I'm protecting him from the consequences of your family's criminal behavior. There's a difference." My phone rang. Colonel's number. "Turn on Channel 8, he said when I answered. I found the remote and switched to the local news station. A reporter stood outside the federal courthouse, describing the morning's arrests in breathless detail. Drake's mugshot filled the screen, followed by Asher's and Judge Trasker's. Sources confirm that the investigation began with information provided by a confidential informant with inside knowledge of the conspiracy. The weapons trafficking charges alone carry potential sentences of 20 years to life. Ember stared at the screen as her world collapsed in real time. The reporter was already speculating about additional arrests, asset forfeitures, and the broader implications for local government corruption. "They'll want to interview me," she said finally. "Probably. You might want to get a lawyer. A real one, not someone connected to your father's network." "Will you help me?" The question caught me off guard. After everything she'd done, everything she'd planned to do, she was asking for my help. Why would I do that? Because of Nate. Because despite everything, we were married for 8 years. Because you're not as cruel as I am. She was right about the last part. I wasn't cruel enough to enjoy watching her complete destruction, even though she'd earned it. But I also wasn't naive enough to trust her again. "I'll make sure you have enough money to start over somewhere else," I said. "And I'll make sure the divorce settlement doesn't leave you completely destitute. But that's all. The rest you'll have to figure out yourself." "Thank you." It was the first time she'd thanked me for anything in years. 3 days later, Drake Torrin passed away in federal detention. The cancer had accelerated under the stress of his arrest, and his body finally gave up the fight. He never saw a trial, never faced sentencing, never had to account publicly for his crimes, but he also never saw me destroyed the way he'd planned. In the end, the man he'd dismissed as a worthless failure had outlasted him. Ember moved to California a week after the funeral. She found work with a small firm that didn't ask too many questions about her family background. We speak occasionally about Nate's schedule and school activities, but the conversations are brief and businesslike. Nate adjusted to Vancouver better than I'd expected. He likes his new school, made friends quickly, and seems relieved to be away from the toxic dynamics of the Torrin family. He visits his mother during school breaks, but he always seems happy to come home. Sometimes I think about that New Year's dinner, about the wine hitting my face, and the moment I decided to stop being a victim. The chair broke first, but everything else followed inevitably. Drake, Ember, Asher, Judge Trasker, they all underestimated the man they were trying to destroy. They learned better, eventually. But by then, it was too late for any of them.